My name is Tim Cain. I worked on Fallout 1 when it was at Interplay for 3.5 years from 94 to 97. I was the producer, the lead programmer, and one of the several designers that were on the team. I'm going to do a quick overview. I assume everybody is familiar with Fallout. Fallout began development in very early of 94. I don't exactly remember when development started because I was actually assigned to other projects. I was doing installers, critical error handlers, sound code for games like Stone Keep. In my spare time, though, I was working on an engine. That kind of grew into Fallout. I realized 94 is a long time. So to remind you guys what was going on, the channel opened between England and France, and it was very popular. A large comet hit Jupiter. Jupiter was okay. And Friends debuted on NBC and was very popular, and Phoebe was my favorite character. So Fallout shipped in October of 97. It took about 3.5 years to make. To put you in the mindset, when it shipped, the games on the shelves were Total Annihilation, which is a top-down RTS, Quake 2, the sequel to Quake 1, very popular game, you may have heard of it, and UO had just shipped. And this is one of the first pictures that comes up if you Google UO. This is Lord British being pwned by a bunch of players. The team size for Fallout, when we started, it was just me. When we shipped, it was about 30 people. I say about 30. It never really had a staff assignment in any official way, and that's what I'll talk to you about in a few minutes, one of the challenges in getting this game made. The total budget was about $3 million. Again, I don't really know. It never had a budget. I never did budget work. It never had really a development plan made for it. It was very unusual the way Fallout was made. It was not your typical Interplay game. At the time Fallout was being made, Interplay owned several licenses, Star Trek and D&D, and we had no license on Fallout. In fact, we had no design spec on Fallout. It was just me working on an engine. We didn't use one of the many engines available. We had the Infinity engine available to us from BioWare. We were beginning work on Torment. I just kind of wanted to make my own engine. Nobody said no. That's the way things worked at Interplay in the 90s, so I just started writing an engine. There was no budget, like I said. I was named the producer, but I really didn't go to producer meetings. They called me a project leader. That just meant that I had to write a report once a week saying what was going on, but I didn't go to producer meetings. I didn't write any reports, and I didn't do anything but sit in my office and work on a game engine. There was no staff, at least at the beginning. Talk about how we staffed up. A lot of work was done over pizza at night after people were supposed to go home. It was the only time I was allowed to talk to people because they were assigned to other projects, and other producers were getting upset if I came by and talked to their guys about anything. So what I would do is I would buy a pizza, go sit in the conference room around 6:30, and if anybody wanted to come in there and talk Fallout, they were welcome to do so. There was no plan written for this game. There was no specs written. It was really a seat-of-the-pants kind of development. So in this postmortem, I've divided it up into several sections. If there's a takeaway I want you to have, though, it's that the team I worked with was absolutely amazing. And I'll talk about them as I go through the postmortem, and I'm going to try to call out individual accomplishments that people did. I tried to remember who worked on what feature and who thought of what cool idea that made it into the game, and even a few that didn't. But it has been 18 years, so I may not remember all of them, and I know some people who worked on it in the audience, and they're going to keep me honest. The first thing I want to do, because it's a common question I get asked, is what influences were there on the game? Why did we end up making Fallout the way we did? I'll talk about books and games and movies that we really liked. I'm going to talk about challenges. The theme of this talk was almost the game that was almost never made. It was almost canceled twice, one of which you may have heard about, one of which you almost certainly didn't. It was just a very rocky road to get this game produced. And finally, I'm going to try to, if I have time, I'll talk about the legacy, some features I see in games now that were not common at all when Fallout was made. So let me start with influences. I broke those up into computer games, paper and pencil and board games, books, and movies. We were a very media spongy group. People every day would talk about, I just saw this movie or I just read this book. And we're not even talking recent ones. I have stuff going back to the 50s that people would come in and go, I just found this book in a used bookstore. We've got to put a town in based on this book. So the computer games, XCOM, and if you haven't played this game, it's wonderful. We all loved the turn-based strategy, strategic combat in this game. The first pass of Fallout actually had very XCOM-y type combat until we got the GURPS license, which I'll also talk about as a big challenge in making this game. Crusader came out while we were making this game. It was one of the first 640, 480 games. It was incredibly sharp compared to the 320, 200 games coming out. It was a big influence on us, and one of the reasons that Fallout was made 640, 480 was Crusader. Wasteland, of course, can't say this strongly enough. Fallout is very much a spiritual successor to Wasteland. Almost everybody who played the game or who worked on Fallout had played Wasteland. When we started, I had not played it. So, of course, somebody gave me a copy, said, go home this weekend. And I was addicted to it, played it all the time. It's kind of hard playing it on a more recent computer because if you've ever tried playing it, it goes too quickly. You have to put in a speed limiter. Otherwise, you shoot across the screen when you try to play. But this game had everything in it that we wanted to have in Fallout, including no strict morality like the Ultima games had. We wanted the player to be good or evil, do anything he wanted, go anywhere he wanted, and be only really restricted by how skillful he was at playing a game. And then, having mentioned the Ultima series as a game full of morality, it was a big influence on our team. For me especially, this is a picture of Ultima 3. It was the first Ultima game I played. I'd never played 1 or 2, and it just stuck in my head as this is the way an RPG should be made. And while Fallout doesn't have a lot in common with Ultima, it really guided how I thought about making an RPG. Paper and pencil games, GURPS. I'll talk about this later when I talk about legal challenges in making this game. But as many of you know, Fallout was based on GURPS for about the second and part of third year of its development, and then we lost the license, or we stopped using the license. However, GURPS as a generic role-playing system really influenced our game in thinking of classless, skill-based characters, and no longer giving people stereotypes to play in the form of character classes. Wiz War, it's a great board game if you haven't played it. It's a great beer and pretzel game. What's fascinating about this game is every time you play it, you shuffle the board pieces together. And we would play this a lot every evening while eating dinner, which we did at work a lot. And we just loved the fact that we could play it every night, and it felt like a completely different game, especially as we made additional cards and just extended the game well past what the original designer had ever intended. And of course, Gamma World, for all of you who played this game, especially when it first came out in 1978. It was not the most balanced RPG, but it was just really fun and had a really good spirit to it, and we loved the idea of mutations and the wide variety of things you could run into when you're playing the game. As for books, there were 3 big books that influenced us. Canticle for Leibowitz, excellent Hugo-winning sci-fi novel, basically about how people would cherish technology after a war occurred. They were pretty much this was part of the basis for the Brotherhood of Steel and Fallout 1. The I Am Legend book, which turned into Omega Man, the Charlton Heston movie. This book was how a individual would handle being the last, thinking he was the last survivor on Earth. This is why in Fallout 1, when you're voted to leave the vault, we really wanted that sense of isolationism, that sense of you're the only person out here in the wasteland who's, quote, a normal person. And we wanted you to feel like special in that way. And finally, there was a book and a movie called On the Beach, which talked about how community would survive past a nuclear war, thinking that they were the only community, and they were very isolated. And then what happens when they do get approached? In this case, it was a U.S. sub beaches near this Australian town, and how those two groups interacted. For movies, Road Warrior, that's a gimme. If you played Fallout, you'll see the jacket is in the game, the gun's in the game, the dog's in the game. A Boy and His Dog, that wasn't the dog. This one was basically had the underground vault. We used to talk about how mutations didn't have to be obvious, because in this case, spoiler warning, the dog's telepathic. It's actually a bit smarter than Don Johnson. So we like to talk about how all the mutations wouldn't be obvious. That didn't really make it into the game. We decided to make the ghouls very obvious and the super mutants very obvious. But The Day After, this is an 80 miniseries that talked about how rapidly civilization would collapse even the day after a bomb falls. And that was something that's very much woven into Fallout. We just assumed after the war there was no civilization left, that it was every man for himself, and there would actually be few vestiges of civilization that would survive a nuclear war. Forbidden Planet, this was especially the art director, Leonard Boraski's idea that the robots in Fallout would be based, or all the technology would be based on technology that the 50s projected into the future. So that's how Fallout got explained to people who were coming onto the team. We didn't want to see Terminator-style robots. We wanted to see Robbie the Robot-style robots. We wanted to see Forbidden Planet-style ray guns, if we did ray guns at all. And we often went back to this movie as a visual touchstone. One, though, that was far more important visually, City of Lost Children. You may recognize that ocular. It's the Power Armor ocular that's on the front cover of the Fallout box. The art staff fell in love with this movie and would play it on continuous tape in their office. Just everything about this movie they loved, the steam-powered, tech, how everything looked like it had large knobs and big dials, and they wanted that look in Fallout. And finally, there's an old still film, which means it's a film, but it's made up of mostly stills, called La Jetée. It's a French film, which talked about how civilization would try to recover from a horrible disaster, possibly nuclear, possibly biological. The art director especially loved the look of the technology in this movie, and he would watch it frequently. Now I want to talk about the challenges in making Fallout. There were a lot, and I tried to put them chronologically, and then I realized they really broke down into 4 big groups that are quite different. And that would be team challenges of how we structured the team as it grew and how we divided up work. Design challenges, things we argued over when we were trying to make the game. Technical challenges, which in the 90s, I hope I don't bore some of you, are going to be talking about just the difficulties of writing to a Super VGA game and dealing with 256 colors in a time where that felt like that was an amazing amount, and now we don't even have to think about such a small number of pixels or such a small number of colors. And finally, I had a number of legal challenges that hit the game, which almost prevented the game from shipping. So I'll point up the 2 times where the game was almost canceled. So for the team challenges, the first one is that we had absolutely no resources for this team. For the first 6 months, it was just me sitting in a room working on an engine. I have no idea why this picture was taken. I have no memory of this. I know I was stressed. If you look carefully in the picture, you see 3 stress-relieving objects. My pink stress ball, a miniature tequila bottle with a sombrero, and a tick action figure. So this is probably just taken while I was working on bugs. After 6 months, I got assigned a scripter and an artist, and they were both named Jason. So people referred to us as Tim and the Jasons, which sounds like a really awful band name. The artist, I had nothing to tell him to do because we hadn't picked a genre yet. All I had was an engine. I'm also colorblind, so I couldn't even tell him this is the color palette I want you to do. I think he ended up making rocks and trees and grass for a few months, almost all of which we threw out because we don't have them in Fallout. Sometime at the beginning of year 1, we really started to get more people. Many of these people worked during year 1 by coming after work and just brainstorming with us, or tried to come up with setting ideas and tried to make assets that we could actually use in the engine I was making. During the second year, we actually ballooned up to almost 15 people. We gained our first lead designer, Scott Campbell, who I think left by the end of year 2. And then we got the lead designer off of Stonekeep, Chris Taylor, and he took the game through to completion. Most of the people are in here, but photographic records of this era are spotty at best. And I had to scour, I have no photographs, and I had to scour the net even to find this Team GURPS photo. Finally, in year 3, we had about 30 people. This is the majority of them. There are a few people that aren't pictured that primarily worked on Fallout, but were actually assigned to other groups. Fallout was not under Black Isle at the time. Black Isle got created in about the last 8 months of Fallout's existence. So Fallout was produced under Interplay's moniker, and then Fallout 2 was done under Black Isle. But Fergus provided us with a lot of people right at the end to let us get a lot of assets done that we otherwise wouldn't have had time to make. The early development of the game was really rough. I actually have a video here of the original prototype with a bunch of art stolen from other games being developed by Interplay. This prototype actually is on the Fallout 1 disc. If you look in an extras folder, you can actually play it. I don't know why I included it otherwise, just to show people what the game would have turned out if it had just been me for 3 years. We had a lot of trouble conveying the idea of this game to other people, especially when we hired them. It was, in the first year, we didn't know what we were making. After we did know what we were making, the team expanded every year to be about double the size it was the year before. It was hard to explain to those people, as well as to marketing, what Fallout was about. We had a dark humor style. It was hard to convey. We had a sort of isolationist. It didn't seem like the game would be fun when you described it to someone. It sounded so morose. But when they played it, they always thought it was a lot of fun. And I had trouble expressing that to people, and especially administration, who, at least on one occasion, just wanted to cancel it because they thought it was too nebulous what we were making. So Chris Taylor made a wonderful vision statement that I'm going to include in the, it's not part of the PowerPoint, but I'll include it in the docs that you can download when you get the talk later. But I included like a page of it here. He basically gave 15 reasons why you wanted to play this game, and he started with mega violence. It goes on to there to things like playing the game your own way, deciding whether you want to be good or evil, and living with the consequences. And that became very difficult later when we were trying to explain why you could kill children. So I'll let you read this on your own. So another challenge we had with this team was we all worked very long hours because it was a very small team. Most people didn't mind. In fact, most people just came in and worked nights and Saturdays all on their own. Where this became a problem was in the last, say, 6 months of this game, we had to go into crunch mode, and since everybody was already working 6-day weeks, we started working every day. For the last year, half a year was being made. People were pretty much at work every day for 12 to 14 hours a day. We joke about it now when I see some of those guys, but there was like 6 months where I never saw a movie or a TV show, a grocery store. A lot of people just started taking their clothes to cleaners because they weren't even home long enough to do laundry. You just lived with these people more than they lived with their own families. It was awesome because we were in our 20s and didn't know any better. I don't know if any of us could do that now. An awesome thing I wanted to point out here, though, that happened was in the last 6 months that Fallout was being developed, a lot of the people who were in QA volunteered to come in on the weekends and work for free. And this is in an environment where if you came in, if you were a QA member at Interplay, you could come in on the weekend and get time and a half or even double time by working on assigned projects. But these people would come in and work on Fallout for free. And I just wanted to point that out because I was flabbergasted that there were these guys who didn't make a lot of money, and they're like, nope, I'd rather get all the bugs out of your game than come in and work on the game I'm assigned. And I just thought that was amazing. So I want to talk about some of the design challenges we hit. And I've hit upon this one a number of times already, but basically the setting for this game was very elusive at the beginning. That prototype you saw gave no hint for setting. So we really wanted to do a fantasy game. A lot of the people came on board and said, oh, we can do something that's better than D&D. We can do something that's, you know, our own twist on fantasy. I think everybody who makes an RPG wants to do that. We quickly threw that out because there were so many other fantasy games being developed, and this is the one choice we made unwittingly that actually saved us from being canceled the first time. And I'll talk about that in just a second. Our second idea was epic. You started in the modern world, you were thrown back in time, you killed the monkey that would evolve into being humans, you went through space travel, you went to the future that was ruled by dinosaurs, you were then exiled to a fantasy planet where magic took you back to the original timeline that you restored to full and came back to the modern world to save your girlfriend. It's weird even hearing me talk about it now, but we really were going to go with this. And I think one of the other producers kind of slapped me and said, there's no way you're going to get the storyline made. It's not going to get approved. You could work on it for years and no one will ever do it. I sometimes wonder what it would be like if we had done this game. And I believe Scott Campbell, the designer at the time, may still have it written down somewhere. I'd love to see it, to see what we thought was cool, 18 years ago. From that, though, we really liked the alien idea that was part of the whole space travel. And we all loved XCOM, so we actually narrowed it down to a storyline involving aliens invading the planet and taking over the entire planet except one city. So you'd go back to that city, which is kind of your home base, and you'd leave the city to go fight the aliens. this isn't what we went with, but it was kind of I'm giving you an idea of how it morphed into Fallout. The idea of the vault that you use as your home base and you went out into the wasteland. We finally one day decided we wanted to try to do Wasteland 2, so we went to post-apocalyptic, and we spent the next year trying to get the Wasteland 2 license from EA. They never gave it to us, but we got so enamored with the idea of making a post-apocalyptic game that we couldn't stop working on it. We just liked it so much that we just changed over all the game to post-apocalyptic and said, well, we didn't get the Wasteland license, we're just, making our own. So we finally went post-apocalyptic, and this is when the first near cancellation occurred for Fallout. Interplay acquired the Forgotten Realms and the Planescape D&D licenses in late '94. And at that time, Fallout came up at a producer meeting as considered for cancellation because at the time, it had only been in development for less than a year. They thought it was a B product. In fact, the dirty little secret in Interplay was they considered it a B product up until the time it shipped. They had thought once it shipped, they were going to get all the people on the team and move them on to real projects, like Descent to Undermountain. They also thought that Fallout was going to be way too competitive with the other games that were on the shelf. They did not want to see their D&D games up there losing dollars to this side project, effectively, that Interplay was also working on. So marketing was convincing Brian Fargo to cancel it because it was too competitive. In the end, I went into Fargo's office and I basically begged. I got down on my hands and knees and I begged him to let us make this game. It was just a few of us. I convinced him it was a tiny budget. I didn't know it would get ballooned to 30 people. And I showed him the work we had done. And I'm amazed. Brian has a lot of positive qualities. I didn't think he'd see from that prototype what we were going to end up with, but he did. And he ended up not canceling the game. The second big design challenge we had was deciding what view to do. At the time, first-person games were coming out and were considered super immersive. That word's been used now for a decade and a half, and I'm still not sure what it means. We wanted to go third-person because it was more strategic to play a turn-based combat system that way. A lot of people call Fallout isometric, just to get really pedantic. It's actually cavalier oblique. You can see the tiles on the ground are not at a perfect 45-degree angle. They're actually tilted 30-60. We did that for a reason. When we laid down the hexes that we're actually going to put on the game, that put the hexes in a nice pattern that made it easy to do calculations from mouse clicks into hex space, which back then you didn't have a lot of cycles to waste. And if we rotated them at this direction, you could do it with just a division by 2, which you could do with a shift and some addition. So we ended up picking that angle for that sole reason. And then the art director liked it because he thought buildings looked better at 30-60 than at 45 degrees. So he bristled every time somebody said we were an isometric game. So like I said, they were good for rotation. They're also really good for distance calculation. You only have 6 rotations. You pick 2 points on the screen. It's very easy to calculate how many hexes are between them. The worst thing about this was it's really bad for up and down movement because you can only go along those 6 directions. And as people went up and down, they would wiggle back and forth. We never really came up with a solution to that, and we shipped with it. Obviously, people didn't think it was that awful, but the art director absolutely hated that. And he wanted to go with a 12 rotation system, but then there's really no good way to make someone walk from 1 hex to a hex 2 up. So I nixed that. For anyone who played the game when it first came out, there was a game timer in it. The player to finish the first quest in a set time or the entire game would fail. This was something that we put in to give the game a sense of urgency, but it was really controversial even among the team. Half of us loved it, half of us hated it. We would argue about it. We argued about it until the day it shipped, and as soon as it shipped out the door, we made a patch that actually took that out. If there's one thing I could go back in time and change, it would be to remove any timed quests from Fallout. I just didn't like the false sense of urgency, and I also felt like the player had this sense he had to rush through the game and miss fun things to do because of that stupid water chip timer. A big problem we had, I told you we were very much media sponges on the team. Everybody wanted to put their own cultural reference stamp into the game, whether it was a TV show they liked or a movie that they liked or even other games they were playing. They wanted to put little inside jokes in so that people playing the game would go, oh, I know what they're talking about. I was worried that not only would we lose players when we had that, but RPGs tend to sit on the shelf for years, and I was afraid we'd look dated. So I made a rule, and the rule for that was if you put in a joke or a cultural reference, if the player didn't get it, they shouldn't even know that that joke or cultural reference was being made. And this image from, this is one of the perks you get for unarmed. It's, if you hit someone, it automatically becomes a critical hit. It's called the Slayer. That makes perfect sense to somebody who just is saying, hey, well, that's a good name for someone who always gets critical hits. It's actually in that way because Chris Taylor was a huge fan of Buffy the Vampire Slayer and wanted at least one perk in there with the name Slayer. Another example that probably nobody would know about because it's so deeply embedded was Gizmo, which was one of the main characters who had voiceover and a nice 3D generated head. He was one of the people who could fight for control of a place called Junktown. Well, Gizmo is a good name for somebody running a place called Junktown. A lot of people think it's a reference to the movie Gremlins. It's actually an inside joke. It was the name of the skunk I owned when I was 12 years old. So now you know. There's a ton of references like that in Fallout, but just being able to pull them out, I probably don't even know most of the ones that my own team put in because, like I said, they buried them so deeply that unless you knew what the inside reference was, you'd never know it was even being made. Naming Fallout was very difficult. It was not named Fallout at the beginning. It was actually named Vault 13. In fact, the batch file for building the game always generated vault13.exe, and even after we renamed it, there was just the last line of the batch file just said copy fallout.13.exe to fallout.exe. We really liked this name. We thought it was science fiction-y and kind of mysterious, but marketing didn't like it because it didn't give any sense of what the game was about. They suggested things like Aftermath and Survivor and the wonderfully generic post-nuclear adventure, which we actually put at the bottom for a while. What really happened was Brian Fargo took the game home. He's the president of Interplay. He took it home and played it over the weekend and came back and put the CD on my desk and said, you should call it Fallout. And it was just a brilliant name. It was one word. We didn't think it would be abbreviated. It captured kind of the essence of the game. And he was really good at naming games, by the way. So we actually switched the name Fallout just in probably like 4 or 5 months before the game shipped. We did most of the box covers and stuff. I'll talk about that. We wanted to name the system as well because at the time, people were not only naming their games, but naming the system used in the game. And when we lost GURPS, everybody felt like we needed to have a name for the system. And since the system we eventually developed had these 7 stats, agility, charisma, endurance, luck, intelligence, perception, and strength. So I said, well, just put them in that order, and it spells ACELIPS. That'll be the name of our system. That lasted a day until Jason Swin, one of the other designers, came in and said, you know, you can rearrange those letters to make the word special, and everybody likes that a little better. So I've never forgiven him for that. Diablo. Fun game. I loved it. Thorn in my side because it came out in '96. And it was real-time, multiplayer, isometric RPG. I had to go to lots of meetings with marketing and the administration. They wanted Fallout to be multiplayer and real-time. Now, we've been making it for 2.5 years. That was not going to happen. But there were a lot of meetings, and it came really close, and it actually slowed down development for a while because we had to do feasibility studies of rewriting the code to make it real-time and rewriting adding a network layer into the game. Finally, I persevered, and even though there were severe doubts in the marketing projections for the success of the game, they let us stay with single player and turn-based. So I'm going to jump into some of the technical challenges. This is a little more, it hasn't aged well. Some of the problems I'm going to bring up, people are going to go, why is this even an issue? Flat memory. Back when I started in '94, PC games were still made with 64K chunks. So you had near and far pointers. You couldn't use a lot of memory. The problem was, since we chose a Super VGA mode, we needed more than a 64K chunk. A new compiler came out, Watcom, had flat mode. I chose to use it. It meant we didn't have to deal with expanded or extended memory, which if you ever play old games, you know you have to tweak those memory drivers to get that just right. We didn't have to worry about that. We also didn't have to worry about those near and far pointers anymore. The downside was all of the old code we just had to rewrite or throw away. So most of the code in Fallout was written specifically just for Fallout, except for a couple pieces that I'll call out later that we grabbed from other games. mainly because we couldn't go back to the old library of interplay stuff and pull out code. We picked Super VGA, which at the time was amazing, 640, 480, 256 colors. I mean, who could ever want more? My artist wanted more. They actually made all of the sprites using Alias, and they made it at high resolution, and they made it with 16-bit color. That meant we had to take those, all the animations they did, all the 3D models, reduce them down to sprite files in 6 rotations, and cut out the colors, reduce the colors from 16 to 256. But then they wanted color cycling, so we had to take like 16, 20 colors out of that so we could reserve for color cycling, so we actually were down to like 230 colors. And then there was another problem we ran into with Super VGA, which is every video card that was manufactured had a different way of doing 640, 480, 256 color. Not just the video card, you had to know what chipset was on the video card. So if somebody said, I have a Trident card, you had a Trident 9600, you had to know, did you have a Trident 9600 chipset A, chipset B, or chipset C? And they all bank switched Super VGA in a different fashion. And you had to write the bank switch separately. And detecting the cards were very difficult. Sometimes you just had to ask the person when they started up the game, what card do you have in your machine? And people didn't know that. Luckily, in late '94, BASIC came out, standardized Super VGA. We rewrote all of our code to that standard. Pretty much is the reason probably the game runs today, is because we go through these standardized interrupts. I doubt if you could play the game if you had to pick an old video card off of a list of 20 and hope that it matched whatever the modern specs were. We chose sprites, obviously. Oh, sorry. We originally thought about doing it polygonally, but the tests we did couldn't give us the level of detail we wanted. But having this many sprites led to an incredibly large footprint, and there was difficulty caching them in. To this day, that's why Fallout sometimes chugs, just because it has to load in a sprite before it can display it. Polygons were just starting to become popular, and believe it or not, we actually argued whether the industry was going to go polygonal or not. People thought, no, sprites are just the way they're always going to do it. Polygons are a fad. Obviously, that was wrong. The talking heads, when you're playing the game and you see those heads that pop up and they're wonderfully detailed and they have voiceover. This was Leonard Borowski's idea, but they were pretty much implemented by another artist named Scott Rodenheiser. Scott would actually form a clay head, heat it in a kiln, and then he would sit there with a 3D scanner, a point scanner, and hit point by point by point by point by point on this head for hours, days at an end, until we had a 3D model which looked like the one in the upper left there. Then we would add the polygons, add the color, and light it. That entire process on here, just to go from the clay model to the one on the bottom right, took about 8 weeks. And then it was another 2 or 3 months to get all the phoneme matching done for all the voiceover that was done. It was probably 4 man-months per head, which is why we only had, I think, a dozen. There was no way we could put more in. We wanted, the original design, I think we wanted 40 or 50 of them. But after we did a couple, we realized that was not going to happen. Followers were not in the original spec for the game, and we had no time to code it when the idea came up that, hey, why don't we have these guys follow you around and help you out, especially in tough areas. So the scripters on the team decided they could do it all in scripting. We put in a few, I think Dogmeat was the first one, and then we added Ian. We sent it to QA, and QA loved it. It tested really well. It was one of the best features we ever had, because people imagined that it was like this. This is what it was like when they were fighting through the wasteland with their follower. When in actuality, it was more like that. And if you ever had Ian in your group and you let him have the Uzi, he would shoot it in burst mode, and he didn't care where you were standing or where the other followers were standing. And we never fixed that because it wasn't done in code. And there was just no way to expose the appropriate AI to script. We literally didn't have the time to do it. So that's why the AI is what it is. And I'm kind of embarrassed about that. This is one of my funnest technical challenges we had. One day, I forget who it was at Airplay, somebody came and said, hey, we want to put the Windows 95 logo on the bottom of the box so people know it's Windows 95 compatible. And I said, sure, that's not a problem, because we tested it on every platform that was out, and Windows 95, WinNT, there were some other Windows we tested it on, and it all worked fine. Well, we failed cert because it worked on Windows NT. I want to repeat that. We failed certification for 95 because it worked on Windows NT. Now, what the certification said was it should fail gracefully on Windows NT. And I remember calling Microsoft and saying, it fails so gracefully that it doesn't fail at all. And they're like, nope, you can't do that. So Chris Jones, the other lead programmer, he just recoded the installer to fail. It would detect that you were on NT and just stop. In hindsight, it was really good he did this because all the Windows that came out, all the Windows platforms that came out after 95 were based on NT. So you could never play Fallout after 95 if we didn't make sure that hand installation still worked. You could just copy all the files over by hand and they worked just fine. We wanted a Mac version. We started with a DOS version, then we had a Windows 95 version. We wanted a Mac version, and it turned out I had put all the OS-specific calls in one set of functions that I bound up into a library, which meant Fallout really isn't written to run on DOS or Windows 95. It calls a library called GNOW, which stands for GNOW's Not Windows, and everything would go through that. The Mac was literally developed in a weekend. One of the Mac programmers went home, rewrote the GNOW library for Mac, and we brought it back, and we had Macintosh running he took it home Friday, we had Mac running on Monday. So I hired, he was too busy to come over on the team, so I hired one Mac developer, and he's responsible for everything that went in to the Mac side. He did the installer, he made sure that the features worked, the assets worked. He also did something that you probably have never heard about, and I insisted upon because I'm stupid. I wanted the save games to be interchangeable among all three platforms, DOS, Windows 95, and Mac, meaning you could be sitting at Windows 95, save your game out to a floppy, pull that floppy out, walk into a Mac machine, put that floppy in, and load it onto Fallout Mac there, and it would run, which meant he had to do all the big Indian, little Indian swapping on the save game. I don't know why I wanted this. Nobody ever used it. It was in the manual. Nobody's ever come up to me and said, I'm so happy you put in interchangeable save games, and it made Tim Hume's life just hell. And I've apologized to him for that. Let me jump quickly to the legal challenges. I'll talk about one that you've probably all heard of. Fallout was originally based on the GURPS license. We got it during our second year. I was the one who really wanted it. I played GURPS all the time. I loved that system. I thought it would be great to have a GURPS RPG finally on the market. However, probably I was at the end of the second year, maybe the beginning of the third, there was problems with them not liking the level of violence in the game. We were very violent. They didn't like the art style. Those skill deck cards with the cartoons on it, they hated those. And actually it was literally too late to change any of these things. We thought we were going to be done in 6 to 8 months. It actually was going to be a little more than a year, but we just couldn't possibly change it. So at this point, I figured we were going to be canceled. The discussions with Steve Jackson Games went above my pay grade. So it went into closed-door meetings over in the administration building. And the word coming out was that we were canceled, and we were going to be moved to Torment or Descent Under Mountain or the other D&D games being made. But what happened was, GURPS was torn out. I was asked to rewrite the GURPS combat system. Chris Taylor was given about a week to redesign it, and I was given a week past that to code it. And if we could do that, then we would not be canceled. So I'm not exactly sure how we did it. My memory of that period is very vague. I know we drank a lot of soda. We were there all the time. I know we smelled bad too, but we did it. In 2 weeks, we redid all the combat sim skill system. And Chris did the entire Fallout game that you're playing, with the exception of perks, were done in 2 weeks. Music, really briefly, the ink spots, which you're hearing at the beginning. We wanted that in the game because it was a nice 1940s, 50s sounding group. It was also my grandfather's favorite group and the first concert my mother attended when she was 6 years old. We went to EMI and we wanted, excuse me, Baby, I Don't Want to Set the World on Fire. They wanted a ton of money for it, and they would negotiate very slowly. All I remember is several months went by before we finally heard back that we weren't going to get it. So we ended up just picking a new one, not quite at random, but really quickly off their back catalog. It's called Maybe. And it turns out that when you actually play the ending, the starting and ending moves of Fallout, actually seems to fit the tone a lot better. If you listen to the words, it's about somebody wondering if the other person's going to miss them when they're not around anymore, which is perfect for Fallout. We had trouble with ratings. I don't know why this was. We were submitted for T. We never said we were T. Our few specs we had were caught out our mega levels of ultra violence and blood and drugs and violence and prostitutes. They saw that, of course, and said you can't have tea, and boom, we got an M rating. We didn't mind that. I think marketing was worried it would reduce the people who would be able to buy it. This led to the child killing controversy. We allowed it. We just said, look, we're going to have kids in the game. If you shoot them, it's a huge penalty to karma. You're really disliked. There are places that won't sell to you. There are people who shoot you on sight. And we thought people can decide what they want to do. There was a small problem with that, in that if you ever did a burst mode with a gun, you sometimes shot children inadvertently. This, of course, contributed to our M rating. However, Europe said no. They wouldn't even sell the game if there were children in the game. We didn't have time to read all the quests. What we just did is we just deleted kids off the disc. So things are there that reference children, but you never see any children. If I have time, I'm going to try to really briefly go over what I think are some of the legacy of Fallout, some of the things that I see in other games that we shipped in '97. It was really seen at Interplay as a big risk that paid off. This is what was said to me constantly by people, even though I don't really think it cost that much. I'm not sure what the risk was that they took, but that's the phrase I always heard. But when I played games over the next few years, I started seeing a lot of things that Fallout had in them, so I thought I wanted to look at it. We always said we wanted an open world. We called it that before the word sandbox came out. I think if Fallout was made today, people would say, what's a sandbox game? We just said, we don't care where people can go. They can go anywhere they want. If they go into some area that's too strong for them, they'll get killed, and then they'll learn not to go in there yet, and they'll look forward to the challenge of being able to go back. We wanted a nonlinear story, so the player could choose wherever he could go, and the story would still unfold, and so the onus was on us for making sure that the stories could unfold that way. And what we did was we said every quest in the game and all the story arcs that occurred in the game had to have multiple solutions. And the mantra we always said was there should be a way to fight your way through it, there should be a way to talk your way through it, and there should be a way to sneak your way through it. And sneaking wasn't just stealth. It could be sneaking up behind or walking up behind a guard, pickpocketing the key, and then using that to get in through an unguarded area in the back. And we always made sure that at least 2 of these were available on all the quests, and usually all 3 on the main quests. Because of that, we came up with the idea of multiple endings. So the game would actually track whenever you did something in the game, we'd store off that you had done that thing. And the quests and short story arcs in the game would have different endings based on that. And then when the game ended itself, that's when we came up with the idea of, hey, we're going to show you slides and say, because you acted this way, here's what's happening to these people that you have been playing this game with for 40 hours. Here's what happened to the people of Junktown or Shady Sands or the Hub. And some of them were pretty horrific. They were like, these people all died because you took their only source of water from them. And we heard later that people would get these slides and then they'd replay the whole game because they didn't want to see that slide. They couldn't live with the idea that they'd killed off an entire population. I like that. We didn't like morality. Like I said, I loved Ultimate games, but I felt like they imposed too much of a you will be a good person. And I'm like, I don't mind if people want to play badly. I just want them to live with the consequences of whatever they do. This was a big thing in the game. It came right out of the Wasteland quest where you're trying to help the little boy at the very beginning, the little orphan who's lost his dog. But when you find the dog is rabid and you have to kill the dog. I love that quest because it made the player feel bad and made him wonder, did he do a good thing or did he do a bad thing? I love that kind of stuff in games. The perk system, like I told you, Chris Taylor made their entire game except for perks in 2 weeks. Brian Fargo took the game home, played it for a weekend, came back and said, I love it, except when I go up a level, skill points aren't enough for me to do. So Chris said, hey, I have an idea what we could do. We'll make a perk mesh of cool things you can add to your character based on prerequisites of what's already in your character. It was really easy to code. It was very successful. QA loved that they could make characters that were different than the guy sitting right next to them in QA, and they could play the game very differently because of it. And I think Chris thought of it in a day, and I implemented it the next day. So we literally had perks in 2 days after Fargo said, there's not enough in here. And he was playing it again the next weekend, and he said, great, this is exactly what I want in the game. I missed that rapidity of iteration in game development. Years later, I was working on Temple of Elemental Evil, and the guys from WotC told me that the perks in Fallout influenced the feats in D&D version 3. And then somebody told me later that the specs in WoW were influenced by the feats in D&D version 3. So I like to think that this all just weaves its way through the industry. And of course, perks were added to Oblivion and Skyrim after the Fallout license went to Bethesda, so I like to think that there's a tiny piece of that in their Bethesda games as well. Called shots. We added those because we really liked the variety they added to combat. You could have one attack mode, but you could see different effects on a creature depending on where you shot them. You might shoot their leg out and they're crippled, or you shoot them and they blind them. It also let us get our humor in. If you check any called shot screen in Fallout, there's usually one that's a little funnier. I think this is the one with you can shoot them in the udder. There's always a groin-based one. In robots, it was called the hydraulic activator. We decided, put the faces of VO in. That really struck a chord with people. They really felt more connected to the game when they could see these really detailed faces and they heard famous actor voices coming out of them. They were, it was one of the best feedbacks we got from the game, and people said they wanted to see more of it. Really expensive to do, not just for the CG, but also getting these actors into the studio. But I think it was worth it and paid off. Ambient music, I'm a huge fan of it. I didn't want standard game music in Fallout. I kind of wanted something, and I think I wrote this next one wrong. I didn't want something you listened to, I wanted something you heard. Something you would play the game and miss when it wasn't there, but not necessarily be humming it while you were playing. And I wanted to underscore that the game was desolate and have a sad undertone to the thing. Again, marketing wasn't sure. They came to me a few times and said, "Are you sure you want this music? Because it's kind of depressing." And I said, "Have you played the game? Everybody's dead in the world, it should be depressing." The development process that I think paid off really big is that vision statement that Chris wrote was really great at getting all these people on the same page when we were talking about the game with them. We also did reuse software. That OS abstraction library was awesome. It really paid off. It went into about a dozen other Interplay games after Fallout shipped. It was in games as diverse from Starfleet Academy to Max to Atomic Bomberman. I mean, just wildly different games all used that. We ended up using a movie player that was written in-house and was used in a lot of different Interplay titles as well. We ended up pulling a script engine out of Starfleet Academy. When we gave them the abstraction library, we took their script engine, and then that percolated into a bunch of different games as well. The last thing I want to talk about, the game, we treated Fallout as an experience from the moment you saw the box, which was fashioned to look like something you would find in the world of Fallout. It was supposed to look like a lunchbox. I'm not sure that ever came across. The manual was a survival guide that was issued to you when you were born in the vault. It was things like, when you eventually get outside, how will you deal with radiation and viruses and giant rats. Logo. This is not the style of the game. I just got it adopted into the Interplay games that shipped subsequent to Fallout. The interface itself was designed to look like old-found pieces of technology from the game world. Our splash screens themselves look like things you'd find. This was a comic book that I don't know why someone would make a comic book about the Vault Dweller being attacked, but there he is. Even our webpage, there was no division of the company that worked on web pages, so we just took it over and made our own. We made it look like, found old art. There was a guy on the team who did the level design, Scott Everts, for the game, and then he'd turn around at night and he'd do all of our web page design. And that's one thing I wanted to tell everybody. This team was amazing to work with. They were incredibly talented. They worked really long hours, just insane hours. And there weren't a lot of egos on the team. If you ever find yourself on a team like this, stay with it. And we all were making the same game. And I've worked on different games since then that maybe not everybody on the team was trying to make the same game. Everybody who worked on Fallout was making the exact same kind of game. There was no disagreements, for the most part, maybe the time request, about what kind of game we were making. And that was just an awesome experience, and it's something I actually miss. So if anybody has any questions, that was Fallout 1. Start with you. Is his mic on? Yeah. So the question was, The ending to Junktown was originally more morally ambiguous, and did we change it? And in hindsight, would we have done that? It was changed, and the original ending was Junktown thrived under the mob boss Gizmo, and did poorly under the Sheriff Killian. And QA kind of liked it. I kind of liked that too. We were worried we led people down the wrong path though, and that, hey, I'm fighting really hard to make this, to do the right thing, and then I'm punished when the game ends. So I'm not sure I'd change that, but I would probably put in more indications that gives, if I were to change it, I'd put in more indications that helping this seemingly bad guy would be a good thing. It was too random. I think that's why it got changed.
Thank you.
Sure. Okay. Okay.
There we go. Okay, so I wanted to poke at the child killing thing a little bit more because these days it's basically a given that if a player-controlled character in any game can harm or especially kill a minor, the ESRB treats that as an automatic adults-only rating. You know, it's basically the equivalent of hardcore porn. Did you guys get a lot of static and threats from the ESRB of the era of that scale, or do you think Fallout kind of pushed for that, or basically, I'm wondering how much sort of drama there was behind that choice.
It didn't cause much drama for the U.S. rating. Okay. People saw it and said, "Well, that's M." But I mean, you have to remember there was a lot of violence in the game. It was just considered part of the genre. In the U.S., we see movies like that all the time. Mm-hmm. Overseas, it's completely flip-flopped. In America, we see a lot of sex, and violence, but we don't see like nudity.
Yeah.
In Europe, it's the exact opposite, and they don't care about frontal nudity, but the level of violence just, I would say, it disappoints them that our movies tend to be childish like that.
Yes.
I think it fit Fallout. I thought it would be okay to have it in Europe. Unfortunately, I don't remember the name of it, but there had been a shooting or something happened in Europe right before Fallout was rated. I don't remember what the tragedy was, but that pretty much made the entire ratings board there just go, we won't even consider it. It wasn't dramatic. It was like, you won't have this game, or we're rated, whatever that rating is, that you have to go into the store and ask for them to pull it out from under the shelf in a brown paper bag. We didn't want that, so we just took the kids out.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd like to ask about the team's approach to player choice, and just was there any systematic design to it, or just kind of ad hoc?
The closest we got to a system was for every main story quest. If you had to go through that quest to get to the end of the game, we would play through it, and I played the game from start to finish 5 times, and then a ton of not quite playthroughs besides that. And everybody on the team did that. And if they ever found a main story quest that they couldn't finish because they made a character that was so extreme that they couldn't fight, talk, or sneak their way past, we would go and take one of those 3 methods and make it much easier. I mean, sometimes it was as easy as, the person who had the key, who was standing by the front gate, and there was a locked door in the back of the building, had a perception of 1. I mean, he would never, ever see you steal, no matter how bad your pickpocketing was. On the side quests, however, I usually let people relax it. If there's only 1 or 2 ways through, and if they were kind of difficult, that was okay, because side quests didn't have to be done. And that was as close as we got. But like I said, we worked together so closely that we all had almost the same mindset of how to put together a quest, that there were never really a lot of arguments over that. That just kind of flowed out. So.
Hi, did you have a working name for, I guess, what later became the Vault Boy, became embraced by the public as the mascot for Fallout? Did you get that character, was that created just sort of on a whim at like the last minute, or was there a lot of iteration during the development of that? And did you realize at the time that that was just going to kind of personify your game and later become like a mascot, a symbol of it?
Are you talking about the one on the perk?
Yeah, the little cartoon guy with the 13 who's always...
Because people sometimes call the Pip Boy Fallout Boy, and I'm like, no, that's not him. That's the guy with the yellow and red cape on the Pip Boy. When I first saw the drawings, that the lead artist had done. I was a little surprised because they reminded me of Monopoly cards, but they really did fit the game really well. They had a great sense of humor, especially when you read, like, here was a card saying, you can viciously kill someone with a backstab. And then there's this funny cartoon of someone slicing someone in two from behind. And it had that Fallout cheekiness of, look, everything's going to be okay. The things we had in the vault literature of, yeah, the world's been destroyed, but we're okay, and here's how you cook rats to make delicious meals. It just had that vibe of, we're not taking this very seriously, and you should be happy. So I think it kind of spread. The team itself had absolutely no problem with it. We were a little surprised when Steve Jackson Games didn't think it fit the game, because I thought it was wonderful. We didn't know how much it would take off, though.
So you just mentioned Fallout cheekiness, and I think that dark humor, which you also touched on, is one of the things that I and a lot of other people love about the game. Can you talk a little bit about the writing process of sort of creating those jokes, and also the process of communicating that sort of ineffable sense of humor to a team of people, some of whom understand it better than others?
Well, I think the original designer on the game, Scott Campbell, he kind of laid out all the different areas in the game. And so later on, when people went through and wrote up the dialogues, and a lot of the dialogues, by the way, weren't written by designers. Some of them were, but we had such a big, diverse group that when the artists would finish doing their art, and it would take a long time for it to get processed, they'd sit there and they'd write dialogues. And remember, they were watching all these dark movies, and everybody was on the same page. So when somebody would write something, often I'd hear people laughing next door, and I'd go over it, and they were just looking at dialogue scripts, and laughing. There was some editing that went through it. The reason I can't speak more about it is I'm really bad at writing dialogue. That's what I learned, so I don't do it anymore. So I'm not exactly sure what the process was, but because everybody was so close, I don't think that they had a formal process. They just shared a lot with each other, and people were willing to change things. If they wrote up a dialogue and people didn't get it or didn't like it, they'd just rewrite it.
Hi. I don't have actually a real question. I just want to tell you thank you. And probably my best moment, my best memory of video game is in Fallout 2, when I get back in time, touch a computer, and I think I just broke the water chip. It's an awesome moment. So thanks a lot.
You're welcome. One more? We only have time for one more question. So,
my question was, in Fallout 2, the quests were a little more robust. They were a little harder to break. And I wondered whether that was simply production changes, better testing, or whether that was a difference in tool chain.
well, I'd actually left Interplay before Fallout 2 went out, but I do know that it's pretty much was the same engine. Actually, the car was working, I think, before I left. So it was really that you had a group of people and they'd all used those tools for years. So it was very easy to go back and make a whole bunch of new content with tools that weren't evolving and had a lot of the major bugs taken out of them. So I think Fallout 2 was just a lot faster to make. And also there was some new influx of people who had really cool ideas for things that could be done with the engine that we didn't see maybe necessarily because we were so close to it. So it had that great mix of established tools with people who know how to use them and some new people who were just, they got the humor and they got everything spot on. And I think that's why Fallout 2 actually scored higher on its review ratings than Fallout 1. So, thank you.